The Trumpet Daily program begins right now.
China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They can't even figure out how to deal with the fact that they have this great division between the China Sea and the mountains in the west. They can't figure out how they're going to deal with the corruption that exists within the system. I mean, they're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not competition for us.
They're not competition for us. Well, hello and welcome to the Trumpet Daily radio show. This is Richard Palmer standing in for your regular host, Mr. Stephen Flurry. He's traveling over back to the United States as we speak. But I thought I'd continue with our tradition that we seem to have developed of opening with a clip, or especially one from Mr. Biden. This time, instead of maybe our more traditional quote about voter fraud, with him on China. And China is becoming the new focus in a lot of the voter fraud investigations. And as that happens, we're getting more and more news of different U.S. companies being in bed with China. There are reports of various different investors into Dominion and some of these other countries coming out of China. And you're seeing Chinese infiltration in so much of U.S. politics. We're going to talk about a bit of that coming up on today's show. We're also going to get into a couple of things that have been big news that you may have forgotten about. COVID, remember that. Coronavirus, what that's doing to our economies. Brexit, that's another bit of a blast from the past. We've not talked about that in a bit. As long as we get time, I've got a pretty thick stack of notes here. We'll get into some of the latest from Brexit. If we don't, we'll just have to save that for next week. But getting into COVID, this does tie in actually quite well with the subject of China. Not only is that where the disease came from, but the response from Britain and America and Australia and all of the Western nations to the coronavirus has given China incredible leverage and incredible power. Why does China have a lot of leverage? Well, a lot of it comes back to money. So much of our money depends on China. We have massive amounts of debt that makes us vulnerable. And so then, well, what are we doing because of coronavirus? We're putting on more debt. We're destroying a lot of our economy that doesn't depend on China. Some of the services and the restaurants and things like that. And, actually, just breaking subject. Sam, can you have a look? There's people on Facebook complaining that there's no sound. We might want to double check some of the streams there. But we're destroying a lot of the things that we don't do with some of these other some of the economy that doesn't have to do with China. And China comes along and says, well, do what we want, or we'll start joining in that destruction as well. That threat has even more leverage. Just going back to that sound thing, it looks like YouTube is fine, but Facebook isn't. So that's probably a problem on Facebook's end then, rather than something with our material. But it would be hard to afford a break with China at the best of times. But now, while so much else is going downhill, while we've got so many other economic problems, that makes it even harder to confront China economically and to have some of these problems. So I want to start with a couple of startling facts today. Here's a headline from CNN. I think this is today's headline. Hill leaders eye new round of stimulus checks as part of $900 billion COVID relief deal. Well, let's just round that to $1 trillion. That's basically what it is. Another huge $1 trillion deal. A number that's just impossible to get your head around. And we'll talk more about that in a second and try and get to grips with, well, what is $1 trillion here? Another $1 trillion that we're looking at spending on coronavirus. But where is all this money coming from? How come we're able to just say, okay, another $1 trillion going to coronavirus spending? Well, here's another startling stat. This is a headline from The Hill. This is even back in October. This is a few months old. Almost a fifth of all US dollars were created this year. So of every dollar made, that's in existence right now, 1 in 5 created this year directly because of coronavirus. We're printing our way through this. This Hill article, it says, the huge growth in stock of dollars reflects the massive interventions in the economy by the Fed, which is in control of the U.S. money supply. So massive intervention in the economy, something we've just never seen before. And whereas a lot of money only ever exists as money in the banks, and it's not physically printed, it's just there on spreadsheets and in databases. It's not like they're physically printing all of these dollars, but they're still creating them. And we're doing it at an astonishing rate. And here in the UK, we've got the same thing. You've got this situation where the government is spending money at just a furious pace. And then when it gets in the UK, we get that money directly from the printing press. The Bank of England creates the money and then loans it straight to the government. And in the US, they're a bit more careful. They have a few more steps. It's a bit more of a roundabout process, so it's not quite going so directly from the printing press to the government. But the process is still broadly similar. And we're setting ourselves up for economic disaster. No wonder the UK is able to keep borrowing, and the US too. Normally, if you're financing yourselves, like governments have throughout history, investors start to say, well, you've borrowed quite a bit of money now. We're not sure you're going to be able to pay that back. Maybe we should stop lending you money. Maybe we should charge you a higher interest rate. Maybe we're not going to be willing to lend you as much. But if you're printing money yourself and just loaning it to the government, almost one government department just printing it and loaning it to another, well, that's never going to happen. You're never going to get these investors saying, well, we're not too sure about this. So instead, we've removed something that would slow us down on this road to debt. And suddenly just printing money and giving it to a different government department, it doesn't mean that everything is fine and that you've got a genuine magic money tree. It just means that you've gotten rid of the mechanism that might make you slow down. And instead, it means we're just barreling full steam ahead into an even bigger crisis. Keep on printing money and, okay, well, fine, the government might not be short of people lending to them, but eventually people are going to start to worry. Maybe my pounds, maybe my dollars just aren't worth anything. After all, that there's so many. If the government can just conjure up money from nothing, well, maybe I shouldn't really hold on to this dollar. Maybe it is valueless. Maybe I should put my money somewhere else or in some other country. Maybe I should stop using dollars. And then when you have governments making those decisions, you're leading to an even bigger disaster. So we haven't saved ourselves by printing money. We're just making the ultimate disaster much, much worse. And we're doing this to ourselves. In the UK, the government just announced what's basically a new lockdown in London. And the economy of London is massive. It's just a huge proportion of the UK economy. In the US, you've got several big cities that contribute a lot to the economy. In the UK, London is really in a league of its own compared to Birmingham, some of these other big cities, way ahead in importance to the economy. So they announced that lockdown, I think it was Monday. The day before, there were 9 deaths due to coronavirus, and should be with coronavirus, I guess, rather than due to. 9 deaths reported. By comparison, 460 people die every day across the UK due to heart disease. Now, that's across the UK, but you're looking at probably at least 100, maybe more in London, dying of heart disease every day. But because 9 people died of coronavirus, well, we're just going to shut down the dynamo of Britain's economy again. So how big is this epic spending? Well, I want to point you to an article by Chris Eames on our website, thetrumpet.com. Actually, it went out as our Trumpet Brief on Tuesday. It's a great article. And if you're not signed up to the Trumpet Brief, I'd really encourage you to do that. It's a way to get on the inside track to a lot of our best material. Our writers highlighting those pieces of news that we think that the most important for you to be paying attention to, and the most interesting, the ones you're going to get the most out of. So you can sign up to that Trumpet Brief at our website, thetrumpet.com. We try to keep it lively and interesting. I think we have some remarkably high open rates. We want to send this we want it to be something valuable. So like I said, you can get that at thetrumpet.com. But on Tuesday, we had this trumpet brief going out from Christopher Eames called "The Cost of Coronavirus is Beyond Imagination." And I'll just pull some stats about it out from it, because he does a great job of trying to get your head around some of these figures that are hard to comprehend. Okay, well, we've just announced another $1 trillion. Well, how big is $1 trillion really? Or we're getting ready for another $1 trillion bailout package. And he begins this article talking about until the end of November, the US has spent a total of $4 trillion on coronavirus. And while that's now out of date, it looks like it's going to be at least 5 with this spending bill, and maybe even close to 6 when you take into account everything that we've spent since October. But you go back and you adjust for inflation, and $4 trillion is equal to the cost of all of America's wars combined, with the exception of World War II. So the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. We've done the war in Iraq. We've talked about the massive amount of strength spent in vain in the war of Iraq. How much money America spent in Iraq, and all that they've really accomplished now is pushing Iraq into the hands of Iran, and we've pulled out, and Iran's taking over. All of that money wasted. Well, that's just a small amount compared to what America spent on coronavirus just this year. Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Vietnam, Korea, World War I, the Civil War, the American Revolution, all the others except for World War II combined. That comes to less than what America has spent just this year on coronavirus. America's coronavirus spending is bigger than any other economy in the world, with the exception of America, China, or Japan. It's about the size of Japan's economy. Every good, every service produced in Japan in a year, that's what America has spent on coronavirus. It's greater than the entire economic output of South America. And he's got several other comparisons, just a massive amount. You combine the entire economic output of the 135 smallest economies in the world, and you get about $4 trillion. 135 countries, everything that they produce, and you get what America spent on coronavirus. And he's got a few other comparisons. With $4 trillion, you could build the Panama Canal 425 times. Now with that extra billion they've announced, that'd be over 500 Panama Canals you could have built with that amount of money. That was the most expensive construction history in America's most expensive construction project in American history to that point. Massive amount of money. And again, that's adjusted for inflation. You could buy Alaska, inflation adjusted, for 30,000 times. That was back in 1867 when America bought Alaska. And you think about some of these projects, when America was building the Panama Canal or when America bought Alaska, these were big pieces of political debate. There were heated arguments. People were accusing the government of wasting money. Even with buying Alaska, no, we shouldn't. That's ridiculous. There was a lot of flack. I think it was President McKinley, if I remember correctly. But there was Sam could probably correct me on that if it's wrong. But a massive political debate when it came to that, and Theodore Roosevelt had a lot of opposition to building the Panama Canal. Not all of that about money, but still a lot of people saying, well, this is a big project. We can't afford to be spending this much money. How many people have even questioned the amount of money we've spent on coronavirus? We're spending amounts, politicians in the past balked at these big projects because of the amount of money they cost, and we're spending 400 times that much, and it's not even debatable. There tend to be bipartisan bills. Just about everyone approves. Maybe 2 or 3 people in the House or the Senate vote against it. And then I'll just read a quote from Mr. Eames's article, because it's just some shocking stats. He said, if we spread it out from when the first confirmed US coronavirus case on January 20th to the start of October, when we hit 4 trillion, that averages to 15.7 billion per day. Okay, so what's 15? That's just numbers. What's 15.7 billion per day? Well, that's 2 Panama Canals every single day, an American Revolution every 4 hours, the Louisiana Purchase every 30 minutes, buying Alaska every 10 minutes over 9 months. He writes, America has now spent $4 trillion in less than a year to fight a virus that doesn't even rank in the top 3 pandemics of the past century. Can we begin to fathom the magnitude of this spending? And then he points out, well, this is just the money that's being spent. That doesn't include the money lost from businesses being shut down and these kind of things. So there's lots more great content in that article. This is just the beginning. He goes to really try and bring those figures alive and show the massive damage America and Britain too, and there's figures from Britain in there as well. The massive damage that our countries are doing to themselves because of this massive spending. But I did also promise we'd get to China. We'll talk a bit about that as well. And like I said, this is something, we're destroying our economy ourselves, and then China, that makes it a better lever for China to use against us. We're seeing more and more evidence of China infiltrating all of the West's, really, economies, politics, media. We've got our latest Trumpet print edition. I think that the aim is to get that out to the printers, I think, today. And we should have a pretty big section in there on China and on this infiltration. But we've seen some news just over the last 2-3 days adding more detail on this. We've got the latest news from Hunter Biden. Fox News had a report on a letter that he wrote in 2017 to a businessman that he was doing deals with. And he wrote a letter, and he begins by saying, best wishes from the entire Biden family. Making sure that it's not just from him, making it very clear what this business relationship is. It's one with the entire Biden family. And he urged that chairman that he was writing to quickly send $10 million to properly fund and operate this joint venture that Biden was running. And he went on to say in the letter, I'm sure you've been well briefed by our dear friend, Director Zhang, on the political and economic connections we have established in countries where you are interested in expanding during the coming months and years. I look forward to our next meeting. So he's saying, well, I'm writing on behalf of the entire Biden family, greetings from the whole Biden family. And then just to make it really clear, well, we've got extensive political and economic connections across all of these different countries. And, well, that's what we can offer you. And so they've infiltrated all these different kinds of, this is just one example of China infiltrating politics, getting to grips, having relationships with all of these, with a lot of these different top politicians. But they are all in all different kinds of areas. It's not just politics. Here's an article from Hollywood Reporter yesterday. They had a story on the man who apparently Joe Biden has in line as his top pick to be America's ambassador to China. The person he's got in mind to send over there, and it is Bob Iger. Bob Iger is the CEO of Disney. This is from the Hollywood Reporter. They write, the Disney executive chairman who once toyed with the idea of a 2020 presidential run is at the top of President-elect Joe Biden's wish list for a key ambassador post, namely China or the UK, sources tell the Hollywood Reporter. So he's top of the line for one of these two jobs. And Bob Iger, he's been very successful with Disney. Maybe he's a very good businessman, politics aside. But you look at what the relationship that he and Disney have had with China, he will be a horrible choice for U.S. ambassador to China, a choice that really is giving in to China in a lot of different ways, caving into them. I mean, so much of the U.S. entertainment industry, and Disney is probably worse than many others, but a lot of the industry has just caved into China. I mean, China they know that that Hollywood and the American industry dominates the world. That's the movies we watch here in the UK. They come from Hollywood. They come out of America. And so if they can, China knows if they can influence Hollywood, they can influence the world. There's a big influence there. And so they tell these companies, you do what we say. We're going to set up certain red lines. You don't cross those lines. You cross those lines and you can't sell your movie in China. There's 1 billion people who will not be able to pay to watch or rent or whatever your movie. So if you want to make lots of money, you've got to let us tell you what you can put in your movies. And it's there throughout the Hollywood industry. You very rarely do you see China being the bad guy in any movie. I kind of remember back, you can go back to, I think, like the early 1990s, say, and after the fall of the USSR, China, in the communist China regime, was kind of like the default bad guy for a lot of contemporary war movies or spy thrillers or that kind of thing. Not anymore. China can't be the bad guy because, well, then China won't let you sell it. They've got to portray China in a positive light, and there's certain restrictions on what they can say and what they can't say about China. And, well, as the Federalist pointed out, you've got, under Bob Iger's time in China, you've got some of the worst pandering to China. They drew attention to the Mulan remake. It's not a movie I've seen or would recommend at all. But they write, Disney's live-action Mulan remake, made under Iger's tenure, was filmed in Xinjiang, the province in which China is interning Uyghur Muslims on a massive scale. The movie thanked 8 government organizations in its credits, including one blacklisted by the US government for its role in abusing the Uyghurs, indicating close collaboration. So you've got China trying to... They invaded this province... I think it was a couple of hundred years ago. It tried to break away during the period of civil war. But this province has had a bit of a separate identity. And China is trying to stamp that out. And they want to send a message to the world and to the Chinese people, well, this is part of China. And they're trying to destroy the culture of those people that live there, the Uyghur Muslims. They're using concentration camps and re-education camps to do that. They're using things like forced abortions and forced sterilizations. It's really evil, some of the things going on in this province. Bringing in ethnic Han Chinese people to come and sleep with Uyghur Muslim women while their husbands are off in concentration camps or in prison camps, to try and make this something that matches the culture of the rest of China. And this movie, Mulan, was part of their propaganda efforts for this, to send this message, well, this is part of China. This needs to conform with the rest of Chinese culture. And Disney got right in line with that effort. They know everything that China was doing, and then they're like, yep, well, we'll keep going with this. Like the Federalist wrote, the Chinese market is extremely lucrative, so Hollywood studios preemptively censor films and make creative decisions that allow them to be approved by the Chinese Communist Party censors. They collaborate with the government to get their movies into Chinese theaters, rather than using their content as leverage to pressure Beijing into better behavior or to speak out on the abuses. It's unpatriotic and immoral. And now, because Disney, well, they own ESPN, and you start to see some of this get into sports as well. You saw Bob Iger get involved in this with the NBA last year, where you had the NBA opposing those that would criticize China. They'll take a stand for Black Lives Matter and injustice in the US, or what they call injustice in the US. They will not take a stand with anything that deals with China because, well, that loses them too much money. And Bob Iger gave a speech about this, and he said, well, the biggest learning from that is that caution is imperative. To take a position that could harm our company in some form would be a big mistake. I just don't think it's something we should engage in a public manner. We shouldn't do public criticism of China. And that's the man that apparently is at the top of Mr. Biden's list for who he wants to be ambassador to China. What kind of a stance does that tell us about the Biden administration on China? Is the Biden administration... I'm talking about a Biden administration. We know what's going to happen, and we've been talking about what is coming up with the next presidential administration on this show. So I should say a proposed or supposed, maybe that would be better, Biden administration. What would a supposed Biden administration be like on China? They'd be soft. They both got this guy that doesn't want to stand up to China lest it hurts his business interests, and they want to make him the ambassador to China. And these people, they'll stand up for abortion rights. They'll stand up for LGBT issues. They'll stand up for all of these leftist causes. But when it comes to standing up to a country that is stamping out democracy in Hong Kong, locking people in concentration camps, well, no, we can't criticize them. That might hurt our business dealings. And it could be easy to kind of say, well, okay, well, it's not that important, though. It's just sports, or it's just movies. And at a certain level, I can see that. There are more important things in this world than sports and movies. But this is about China working to conquer American minds and even the world's minds, change the perception of China to influence how the entire rest of the world thinks. It's also top businessmen not being prepared to fight for freedom, to fight for their country, to fight for their country's values. We have an evil regime here. And the response of so many of these businessmen in America, in Britain, in a whole load of other countries is to say, sure, I'll work with them. I'll work with them if it makes me money. And we had an article on our website a few days back, I'm trying to remember exactly when, talking about some of these big sports manufacturing companies that will pay to have their products manufactured by the Chinese or in Xinjiang, in this province with these concentration camps. And they're working against a American bill that would put sanctions on this. And again, it's the same kind of woke, trendy companies that are right there saying, well, we need to stand up to injustice when it comes to Black Lives Matter. But if America tries to stand up to China, they start lobbying congressmen to say, no, we shouldn't do that. That might lose us some money. But it's also important because when we're talking about Hollywood, so many of these media companies, well, they work in news reporting as well. And you're seeing the same attitudes, not just from places making entertainment, but places covering the news too. And Molly Hemingway was talking about this on Fox News, just with some of the Hunter Biden scandals and the way that the media refused to cover it. Here's what she said. This is clip 2.
It's absolutely right that the media have not been covering this as they should. I think the New York Times still hasn't told its readers about Eric Swalwell being compromised in this way. China does target a lot of people. They have a really advanced spying operation, and so it's not just a problem that Democrats are dealing with. What is so disconcerting about this particular situation is that the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence really should have been spending a lot of time on this threat. That's kind of what they exist for. And every time in the previous years that Devin Nunes or Republicans tried to focus on China, the hearings were hijacked by Democrats, whether it was Swalwell or Schiff, to talk about Russia and the Russia collusion hoax. Russia is also a bad actor and needs oversight as well. But we really have not done what we need to do with China, given how successful they have been in various hacking and spying operations in recent years. And they have really gotten a lot of control. I think one of the reasons why the media haven't covered this like they should have is that the media themselves are one of the institutions that seem to be compromised by China. They either support China or they're afraid of being in China's crosshairs. And this makes it even more difficult for the American people to really learn what's at risk here.
So that's why you don't hear about this from the media. The New York Times just won't hit some of these stories. The Daily Caller had a headline a couple of weeks ago. Beijing-controlled news outlet paid U.S. newspapers millions to publish propaganda this year. And they talk about this English language paper called China Daily, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party. And they pay for advertising with this. And there's a lot of money that they pay to various different U.S. news companies to print this. And I think they totaled it up to around $2 million. And I don't think that's probably not the total amount of monies that are involved here. As far as advertising goes, that's not a gigantic amount, but it's just one example, and I'm sure there are many, many more of the links that China has to some of these media companies. There's the China Watch that they pay the Wall Street Journal to produce. The China Daily, they paid the LA Times $340,000, $100,000 to the Financial Times, over $350,000 to Canada's Globe and Mail, nearly $100,000 to the Houston Chronicle, $76,000 to the Boston Globe. Between 2016 and 2020, China Daily paid the Washington Post $4.6 million in advertising. $4.6 million. During those same 4 years, it paid $6 million to the Wall Street Journal for advertisement. And we saw this over here in the UK back in 2005. Peter Oborne, he was a journalist. He cut his ties with the Telegraph, accusing them of softening their Chinese coverage so that they wouldn't jeopardize the money they were getting from something similar, China Watch, which was a paid publication that was getting sent out with the Telegraph, where they were getting advertising money from China. I do kind of wonder whether the UK government has taken a leaf out of China's books. They've spent huge amounts on advertising this year, paying for advertising on for coronavirus lockdowns and people to conform to all of their guidelines and diktats and things like that. Massive injection of cash into the UK media industry. And then you find the UK media industry is very critical, very hesitant to criticize lockdowns. Well, why is that? Could it be that they're getting millions of pounds from the US government? Well, that's another subject. But you can see how money quickly corrupts a lot of different media. But you're seeing China even get involved in all areas of business, and businesses, even that they're not publication businesses, they've got to be very careful about what they say about China, or they get in a lot of trouble. For example, back in 2008, this is how careful you have to be if you're a US company when it comes to dealing with China. There was an employee running Marriott International Twitter account, so a hotel chain, and he liked a tweet from a Tibetan separatist group. Didn't say anything, he just clicked the like button. And the group had praised Marriott for listing Tibet as a separate company from China. And he liked that tweet. And then the Chinese government responded by blocking Marriott's website and mobile app for a week. Telling Marriott, you can't go liking those tweets if you want to do business in China. If you want China's 1 billion citizens to be able to book with Marriott hotels, you've got to do what we say. And sure enough, Marriott caved in. They fired the person for liking a tweet after just a week. And they posted a groveling apology to China. And so this just gets involved in so many different areas. You see this influence in politics. You see it in business. You see it in media. You see it in entertainment. You see it in industry. Where is this going to end? What is the end game here? What is China going to do? Well, we don't have to guess. We can know. You can get a good look at where this is heading, what China acts like when it gets all of these different bits of control. You can just look at Australia. What's going on with Australia right now is a clear warning to the whole world on what happens when China gets this kind of leverage. I think a lot of people, especially on the left, would maybe agree, okay, well, yeah, maybe China is a bit too big and we don't agree with everything that they're doing. But I think many on the left would say, well, China used that power to blackmail America or anything like that. Come on, man. That's not the way countries behave in the 21st century. I think that's in general, many on the left, many even on the right, they're not too worried about China actually using this leverage. Well, that's 18th century or 19th century politics. We're more modern and sophisticated than that now. Well, really? What happens when you get this kind of relationship with China? Well, Australia has I think they're just a few steps down the path from America. They've walked down this track a little bit further. And you can look at what has been happening over the last few months in Australia and get a vivid picture of what is coming to America if nothing changes. If they don't stand up and make the painful decisions to confront China now. China is by some measures the world's largest economy. It's been growing by about 10% a year since 1990 or so. It's dipped a little in recent years, but a massive amount of growth. And it takes a massive amount of raw materials for that. And Australia has been a source for a lot of these raw materials. In 2017, 1/3 of Australia's exports went to China. And then by, I think over the summer, it hit half. Half of everything Australia sells around the world going just to one country, going to China. And so soon you see this, as this trade relationship is built, you've seen this go in other areas. About 1% of Australia's land area is owned by China or Chinese companies now, because they've been buying up coal mines and massive farms and tourist resorts, even tens of thousands of private homes. By 2019, China was Australia's 9th largest foreign investor, but then they were channeling a lot of that investment through Hong Kong, the 5th largest Australian investor. And so then you see this relationship in Australia start to get into maybe military areas. You see China signing a 99-year lease on Australia's northernmost port in Darwin, a vital military port, one where there's a US military base, I think about 2,500 American troops. And then they've been getting hold of all 99-year leases on some of these other ports, a 100-year lease on the Western Australia Meridian Airport. I don't know why the airport gets 100 years and the and the port they only get for 99 years, why they decide they need that airport for 1 year longer. Probably an irrelevant detail. But all of this trade leads to a close political relationship. You saw in 2014, the Australian government invited President Xi Jinping to come in and address their parliament. And talk about how close these countries are. And then you start to see the dark side in this investigation. You start to see China being accused of hacking Australia's elections. China meddling at Australia's elections, bribing politicians. In 2017, Australia's public TV station, ABC, they released a report showing that billionaires with links to the Chinese Communist Party were donating millions to different Australian political parties. They were building close relationships with Australia's political elites. And then you had a book come out in 2018 by a university professor, Clive Hamilton, called Silent Invasion, documenting the Chinese Communist Party infiltration into Australian corporations and universities, governments, even into religions and churches, trying to affect what religious preachers said. By coming in and having lots of loyal Chinese Communist Party members become donors to their churches and things like that. And he was warning in this book that China was working to turn Australia into a puppet state. He said that Australia, he said, has received a wave of Chinese billionaires with shady histories and tight links to the party, media owners creating Beijing mouthpieces, patriotic students brainwashed from birth, and professionals marshaled into pro-Beijing associations set up by the Chinese embassy. Now, after the ABC allegations came out and this book and things like that, the Australian Senator Sam Dastyari, he resigned. The nation had to change its rules on politicians receiving donations from abroad because they were worried about how many politicians were being bought off by Chinese billionaires, by business people with links to the Chinese Communist Party. Is this starting to sound familiar? Can we think of rich Chinese Communist Party members that have links maybe to American politicians and their families? This is not just a Hunter Biden problem. This is a deliberate Chinese strategy that they have tried in country after country. And other politicians received thinly disguised bribes. You had China's special envoy, for example, who signed off on China getting this lease on the port of Darwin, this really strategically important port. Well, as soon as he left political office, he was given a job worth an estimated $2 million plus expenses at the company to which he had just leased the port. I mean, that's so corrupt, even the European Union tries to ban that kind of thing. And they're one of the most corrupt organizations in the Western world. Just to do a deal and then walk out and get a lucrative job with the company you just did a deal with. And like I mentioned, there's been accusations of election hacking. 3 months prior to Australia's 2019 election, somebody hacked the computer systems in Australia's parliament and their major political parties. An Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, at the time, he said the attack was sophisticated, probably the work of a foreign government. And sure enough, it emerged that that foreign government was China, hacking the Australian election. And then you see, well, now we're starting to see, well, what are the consequences of that? Australia started waking up to some of these problems. And there has been a slow turnaround. In 2016, the Australian government blocked Chinese investment in the nation's energy infrastructure over these national security concerns. In 2018, they blocked Huawei from developing Australia's 5G network. And then this year, there's been a really strong response from Australia. They tried to hold China responsible for the spread of coronavirus, of COVID-19. They started conducting investigations into the origin of the virus. And so you've had a furious reaction from China saying, well, look, your economy depends on us. Stop this or we'll destroy your economy. That's basically been China's response. They've put tariffs on Australian barley, wheat, and coal. They've suddenly found a whole bunch of defects in different Australian products like copper and cotton. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Sugar, timber. the one that kind of cracks me up is they've blocked Australia's lamb exports to China because of coronavirus concerns. Australia's COVID rates are tiny. They're fine with coronavirus, with lambs coming in and sheep coming in from Brazil and I think America and all these other countries, but Australia, well, it can't come in because we're worried about coronavirus. About 40% of Australia's wine exports used to go to China. And then in November, they imposed massive tariffs, up to 200%. This is not just a small tax on the price of your wine. This is tripling the price of Australian wine in China. This is making it so vastly expensive, they pretty much can't sell it anymore. Which has led to a Drink for Victory campaign over here in the UK, trying to encourage people to support democracy by buying Australian wine. At least there's an easy way to support democracy sometimes. But week by week, China is ratcheting up the economic damage with more and more of these tariffs. But there have also been some of these other strikes, some of these other attacks that are really quite sinister. So on November 30th, an official Twitter account of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs posted a fake photo showing a grinning Australian soldier holding a knife covered in blood at the throat of an Afghan child. And the caption said, "Don't be afraid, we're coming in peace." So China's trying to spread this lie, basically, that Australian soldiers killed Muslim children in the Middle East. And there've been these accusations before. Australia's held inquiries into it. There's been no evidence of Australian soldiers killing children. But China is spreading this lie. That's a lie that could get Australian citizens killed. That's a lie that could lead to incite terrorist attacks and all kinds of repercussions. But they're happy to spread that lie. And China's delivered Australia a 14-point ultimatum. This is the kind of thing you normally get in a war. And it's a trade war, really. Saying, look, if you want to sell to China, if you want your economy back, if you want us to not just collapse your economy, well, these are our conditions. You've got to open up all of your country to Chinese investment. No more shutting us out due to national security concerns. No more keeping us out of 5G infrastructure or telecoms or energy. We want full access, which of course they could use to spy and gain even more power. But we want full access and stop criticizing the Chinese government. No criticism over Hong Kong. No criticism over Tibet. No criticism over Xinjiang. You've just got to be positive. You can't say anything bad about us. Now, you submit to our conditions and, you can trade. We'll give you your economy back. That's the kind of thing this is the world that we live in. You become dependent on a nation like China. And I think China is much better placed than almost anyone else to make these kind of threats because they're a dictatorship and they have much more government control over their economy. They can really use that economy as a lever much more than other countries can. But say, look, we'll use our economic power to impoverish you unless you do what we want. That's the situation Australia's in. And it's a really hard situation for Australia. And one of the things that makes it so hard is that they're so divided because of Chinese infiltration. Because China's infiltrated Australian politics. And some of that, I'm sure there's bribery and things like that going on. Some of it just naturally comes from China being your biggest trading partner. Because if a third of your exports go to China, there's a lot of jobs in Australia that depend on trade with China. And those jobs aren't going to be evenly distributed. Some of those jobs are going to be concentrated in one place and rather than others. And so those politicians, where you've got a lot of jobs depending on China, they've got a strong incentive to support China in this trade war. Add into that some of this bribery and other things going on, and you can really see how China can divide Australia, and that's exactly what they're doing. In 2019, you had the state of Victoria signing an agreement to join China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is just bizarre. It'd be like Texas deciding it's going to go and sign some trade agreement with China, or it's just one part of Australia breaking off and having a completely different policy to China. By 2019, the Australian government is trying to distance itself from China and realizing, okay, we've got a bit of a problem here. And then one of their states is basically going and signing an alliance with them. That's what this divide and rule looks like. China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is Chinese region or different regions signing up, getting access to Chinese funds, especially to improve their transport infrastructure. And in return, basically becoming Chinese allies, getting drawn into that Chinese orbit. And there's this state doing it. And then you've got this really interesting quid pro quo. You'd have thought by now I'd have learned to say that properly. Quid pro quo going on between Victoria's Premier Dan Andrews and China, where the tariffs that China's put on so far have not hit Victoria that hard. They've not hit this state. And in return, the Premier Dan Andrews, he's taken China's side in this debate, in this trade war, and he's criticized the government for standing up for China. Now, I think he knows that if he switched and if he were to support the government and criticize China, well, that policy of not hurting Victoria would change fast. And then you've got Queensland Premier that she's also urged the government to end hostilities with China. And then you've got business leaders doing the same thing, this split, different business leaders on each side. One of Australia's top kind of mining tycoons, he brought a Chinese diplomat alongside him to an official event that a government minister was attending without telling the government minister, and just kind of ambushing him with this Chinese official. And he said, Australia needs to walk that line where we have a best friend in America, a best friend in China, best friends across Southeast Asia. And then you've got people taking China's side in the media. You've got a big business media owner who runs the West Australian newspaper and a bunch of others, and he had a big article on the front page saying if we're going into the biggest debt we've ever had in our lives and then simultaneously poke our biggest provider of income in the eye, it's not necessarily the smartest thing you can do. And about China, he said, well, China probably owes the world an explanation on the origins of COVID-19, but we need to stop making accusations. We can't. They may be in the wrong, but we can't accuse them, because that would cost us money. Now, to be fair, I kind of agree with him in that Australia's going massively into debt, just like we talked about in the first half. We're destroying our own economies. While you're to then attack China at the same time, yeah, you are risking massive economic damage. He's right about that. That's just what makes, I think, this time period so powerful for China. But that's what it takes if you want to. That's Chinese ultimatum. Take massive economic damage or submit to us. Say what we want you to say. And so this is the situation that the world is facing in a lot of ways. This is what's coming to America if we continue down this road. China keeping on getting influence, keeping on building relationships with more American politicians, and then issuing an ultimatum. This is what we want, and if you don't give it to us, we'll cut off your economy. And then a whole bunch of American politicians and states even taking China's side in this decision. And American media taking China's side in this confrontation. That's where we're heading. And the Bible even talks about this type of thing happening, this type of thing coming. Isaiah chapter 23, for example, it describes a mart of nations, a trade alliance. And it talks about Kittim, a biblical name for China, as being part of this mart of nations, this overseas trading alliance. Then there are other passages like Deuteronomy chapter 28 that talk about America being besieged, being cut off from world trade. Basically having received an ultimatum, you do what we want, submit to us, or we're just going to cut you off. Now, Isaiah chapter 23 reveals that China is going to be working with other nations. There are other powers mentioned there, particularly European powers. It talks about Tyre, this big financial center, and in biblical prophecy, that's a type of this coming European financial center that you can read about in Revelation chapter 18, for example. So to bring down an economy as big as America, China doesn't do it alone. But this is what's coming. And maybe if it weren't for President Trump, and maybe if it weren't for the changes that we're in, President Trump coming in and continuing his presidency like we're anticipating, well, maybe that would come a lot sooner. And we can look at 2 Kings just very quickly. I'll spend a little more time with this rather than trying to rush talking about Brexit in 7 minutes. I'll have to save the Brexit content for when I'm on the show next week. It'll make for a slightly less hectic morning anyway, to have a few things prepared ahead of time. And we might actually know what's going to happen after the end of the year with Brexit by next week. 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 26 says, "For the Eternal saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter, that there was not any shut up, nor any left, nor any helper for Israel." Or a bitter affliction. And that word affliction, you can look it up, and it talks about depression, misery. There's a sense of hopelessness. It's basically saying the situation in Israel was hopeless. And then it talks about, well, there was no helper, no one left. And then verse 27, "And the Eternal said not that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash." So God came along and saved Israel anciently. But this book of Kings, it's the former prophets. You can turn to the book of Amos that very clearly has prophecies that haven't been fulfilled yet, that are coming in the future. And you can see those at the end of Amos chapter 9. And that talks about Jeroboam II. This book of prophecy talks about this Jeroboam II. Why? Well, because this history is a type of what's coming in the future, or of a type of what is happening right now. That Israel and the descendants of Israel, Britain and America and Judah in the Middle East, that they're bitter. And there's a lot of it, there's almost no hope. And then God comes along and saves them through one man. Now it's still God doing it. And he uses, anciently, Jeroboam II was not a righteous individual. But God comes along and he saves the nation temporarily. Gives a time for him to finish his work. But then Israel still went into captivity, I think about 30 years after Jeroboam's reign ended, and things fell apart much, much quicker than that, really. But you've got this temporary saving. And I think when you see this bitter affliction with America in a lot of different ways, you see it with all of the division. You see it in the riots that we saw coming across the America. You see it in the radical left takeover. Does China and the influence that it's gaining, does it have a role in this bitter affliction? I mean, you see Australia, and it's hard to see a way out for them. Are they just is that their future now, just having to submit to China? Well, we'll wait and see. And maybe we'll see President Trump doing something about the Australian situation. But everywhere you look, there are problems for America. It's almost like this verse talks about. It's hopeless. You look internally, you look externally. There are these problems everywhere. Bitter affliction. But it is important just to keep watching some of these other problems all around the world. This is something that we've really drawn close attention to. And Trumpet Editor-in-Chief talks about this in his book, America Under Attack, and Great Again, that there are problems internally, but one of the biggest and worst impacts of these internal problems is it then opens America up to what's going on outside, to problems from without. In a lot of his writing, Mr. Flurry traces the root of the attack on Britain and America and the affliction to Satan the devil, which makes sense. If you believe the Bible, then the Bible talks about there being an evil spirit being. And if Britain and America, if they're the descendants of Israel, this nation that God has a plan for on behalf of the whole world and to benefit the whole world, well, of course, Satan would be working against them. And so this is what Mr. Flurry wrote in an article, Why is the Pope Meddling in American Politics? Believe it or not, Satan the devil is unleashing a multi-pronged attack on what has until recently been the most powerful single nation in history. He is working with the population by encouraging sin and perversion, and you see how this deterioration of morals is affecting our whole nation. He is turning factions within our people against one another, stirring hatred and violence that are tearing us apart. We see that definitely. He is working from within the nation through leaders that are destroying America's values and embracing lawlessness and corruption. And at the same time, he is fomenting hatred among America's enemies, empowering them to aggressively work against the national interest. And he talked about the same attack in his book, America Under Attack. He said, if you look at the whole story in biblical prophecy, you see that Satan has a three-pronged attack. First, he attacks God's church. Second, he tears down the values within the nation of Israel. Finally, he brings in the Holy Roman Empire, this foreign power, to destroy those nations in the Great Tribulation. This is Satan's master plan to destroy spiritual and physical Israel. And Mr. Floyd continued writing. He wrote about this in Great Again. He wrote about the rioters and the violent protesters may think they'll come out as the victors, but God says no. Your enemies from without are going to exploit the division, violence, and anarchy within your nation. There won't be any winners from within the nation. That is what God is saying. Bible prophecy makes clear that even worse and more violent protests and riots are going to erupt in British cities. This will fatally weaken the nation and lead to curses of a far greater magnitude. That's what you see with China already. Countries stepping in there, seeing the division in American politics and taking advantage of it, injecting money into the American political system, playing up with this division, taking advantage of America's weakness on the international scene. And it's a warning that foreign powers are going to exploit this division. Now, we also see in what's happening in America great hope. God has a plan for Israel. He's measuring the destruction that comes on Israel, what happens and when. Because as bad as things get, it is all part of a wonderful plan that God has for Britain, for America, and for the whole world. Well, that's about all I have time for. Please do tune in once again tomorrow here at on the Trumpet Daily radio show at KPCG. You can listen live on 101.3 on the FM dial or at kpcg.fm.